Sabbaticals are not just some glorified glitz and glam break. We've been talking a lot today about the deep work that we all have to do when we're trying to figure out who we are when we're not working. And it's really tempting to think that this is just something only available to people who are on like lifestyles of the rich and famous. Like, how are we going to actually afford something like this? So today we're going to talk about some real practical steps you can take to create a plan. And whether you're starting from scratch and you've not saved a dime for something like this, or you have been working on towards this and you're trying to figure out how to actually execute. Um, you know, the number one question you think that we have is about this affording the sabbatical. But actually, in the clients that I've worked with, this is one of several questions that we're all facing. I worked with a client a while back who we had worked on a plan for more than a year and a half to financially create a self-paid sabbatical, a break from work. And she really, it wasn't the money that was going to prevent her from taking this work break. She was honestly struggling with many other concerns, some of which we've touched on today. Like, for instance, what am I going to tell people about this? Like, how am I going to talk to friends at happy hours and tell my family members? It's a big question, right? Am I going to actually be employable when this is over? Like, who's going to want me when I just suddenly have this gap in my resume, right? That's a financial consideration to think about too. But also, what am I going to do, and who am I going to be while I'm on work break? So this client that I was working with was really struggling with the second question of like, what am I going to do? She was a lawyer and a partner at a law firm at that. And she's thinking to herself, if I leave law, who am I? What am I going to do? Um, of course, in my role as a financial advisor, I'm not going to tell my clients what their life is about, right? I wanted to facilitate her thinking through some of these questions for herself and really just be there as a sounding board to let her know, like, I don't have all the answers, but I do know that money's not going to be the thing that prevents you from doing this. So with time, she worked on this and struggled with it and eventually took the leap to take a year off from work. And she didn't have the answers to all of these questions lined up before she did it. It really was a leap of faith. But in the end, after taking a journey around the United States in her van and camping and getting to travel to Europe and do some thought work, and just be alone with herself, she came up with a solution. And the solution was something she wasn't planning on or didn't even think would be part of her path at all. She found out that she could do contract legal work living wherever she wanted in the world. And so she eventually set up a plan to do that. And now she can ramp up and ramp down her work in a way that she didn't conceive of when she started off on this journey. So there's a lot to think about when it comes to working out this decision to take this work break, right? So I want to offer throughout my presentation some questions for reflection. So when we think about making this plan for ourselves, kind of gather what resources, what support do I actually already have in my life? And how can I tap into this as I think about creating my plan to take a work break? And where maybe I have some gaps, what can I do to build up some additional trusted support around me? Having kind of a group of people you can belong with when you're on work break is so important. And that's why groups like Growth Years can be so valuable when you're trying to consider something like this. In all my work, working with clients, my own experience, interviewing all the people I interviewed for my book, The Art of the Sabbatical, I've come across some really common phenomenon that may actually impact your finances, right? One thing is pretty quickly, within 6 to 8 weeks, some boredom is going to set in, and you have to know that this is 100% okay. You eventually figure this out, and it's actually a sign that there's good things to come, right? It's a learning process. It's a sign that we've reached a level where we're maybe not thinking about that crazy burnout, that experience, all the things that got us spun up all the time at our day job. And now we're coming to reality with, okay, well, what's next? So the boredom is actually a turning point, not a concern. And once we do get to that point, we may think, oh, shoot, I'm barely just into this. Like, well, how am I already going to have to go back to work? So most people end up taking at least 3 months longer than they initially planned when they start out. So a lot of people today talked about a gap year, taking a year off. A lot of people I work with initially put the line in the sand of more like a 3 to 6 month work break. But the vast majority of people that I've worked with end up extending their sabbatical. And so this is a financial thing that we have to consider. And part of the reason for this, one reason is, hiring timelines lines last quite a bit of time, and we may not have planned for that. We also may just be kind of sitting in the moment of our work break thinking, wow, like I'm soaking it all in. I'm still experiencing this. It's not yet time to go back to work. So it's worth kind of having a little contingency cushion of money to support you if you find yourself in this position of having to extend your work break. The other aspect is that life doesn't stop. And what I mean by that is, things can happen with our family, with our own health, with our cars, with dental emergencies, right? So, like, there's all sorts of things that keep happening. And just because we're on sabbatical doesn't mean those things in our life don't stop. So, we do have to plan for financial contingencies just like we would if we were working. It's important to maintain an emergency fund, whether we're working and we've got a steady paycheck or we're taking a self-paid work break. And so if you're thinking, oh, I've got this emergency fund set aside, I'm going to use that for my sabbatical, make sure you still kind of hold some reserves in cash to cover, anything related to a family emergency or some kind of like home maintenance emergency that might emerge while you're on work break. So let's get into some of the nitty gritty here. So some of the financial scenarios. There's two main financial scenarios you might find yourself in. One is I have the money and I really want to do this, but I'm just kind of struggling with the how. How do I budget for this? How do I think about my money when I start spending it on this self-paid work break? Or you're like many people and you're like, I really want to do this. I'm struggling with the burnout. I'm doing all the things that we've been talking about today. Where in the heck do I begin? So let's dive in. Let's start with the first one. I have the money for this. What do I do? And so what I find the biggest takeaway on this is that you need to start thinking about your everyday expenses, like month to month, like your rent or mortgage payment, covering healthcare, covering childcare, things like that, and a separate bucket from the one-time expenses that are going to come up because you're on work break. Like this is training, fun stuff, paying for some kind of a hobby, taking a big trip. We want to think about that as a separate bucket of money because when we exclude those costs, we can make a quick and easy calculation to figure out how many months of cash we have available. We can take our total save for sabbatical and then just divide it by our monthly living expenses. And we immediately have this thing called a run rate. If you're in the startup world, you might be very familiar with this word. How many months of cash do we have available to continue running? And this can be a freeing number to know for our own personal finances because when we know, hey, I'm solid, I've got 6 more months left, I'm feeling good, I'm rocking and rolling on my progress here. It can free up that anxiety that we all might be feeling when we've let go of our day-to-day paycheck. And so this math is really great because then we can see these other one-time expenses, this bucket of like our fun money, our big things we want to do, the class we want to take. And we can say, look, I've got the money set aside for those important things. I've prioritized them. I've made a plan for it. And yet I still have X number of months available to cover my living expenses. I mentioned contingencies. This is important here. And I would add a little plus sign on top of the total I have saved for sabbatical for these contingencies. In the financial planning world, we always talk about having 3 to 6 months of our living expenses covered as just a general kind of fund available for just things that are unexpected in our lives. And so I would say that this is important to have as well while you're on work break. The truth is, when you're starting on this kind of numbers game, most people think, oh, well, I've got to figure out a way to support my salary. And actually, no, we really are in the expense world at this stage. We don't have to replace our salary. And likely one of the reasons why you're able to afford a sabbatical in the first place is because you're not spending all the money that you have coming in through your take-home pay. You're setting aside money from savings. And so this works in your favor because the more, before you take your sabbatical, the more money you're saving up from your take-home pay, the less money you're spending. That means that the dollars you're saving can go further. And you're working toward replacing those expenses, not your income. So that's a really important distinction because sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming to think about having a pot of money that fully replaces your income. So this is a good chart to kind of screenshot, take a look. There's a whole bunch of more resources in my book about this particular topic itself. But in the meantime, here's another question for reflection. So how would it feel to take this time off, knowing you plan for those contingencies, knowing you had a bucket for those one-time expenses, and knowing that your month-to-month expenses were taken care of? What else would make you feel confident? So scenario two, maybe you're starting from scratch. You've joined up here today thinking, I'm feeling some of this pain and burnout, and I really haven't taken a break in my life. I know in the United States, we hardly even take our vacation days, and it's a real sad state of affairs because the idea of taking 3 months off or 6 months off from work just seems like this, wow, like in the United States, like what a luxury. Um, but you're really feeling the pain, of the burnout and of these concerns that you're seeing around you, right? So if you're trying to plan from scratch, it can feel a little like, where do I begin here? The number one tip I have on this is you've got to start automating savings. So, everybody's got deductions that come out of your paycheck automatically, and that means like you don't think about those things. You don't think about the money going to retirement, going to pay for your health care out of your paycheck. You can do the same thing with your savings. You can start to automate this. And basically, every time you get a paycheck, just set it up with your bank to auto transfer from checking to savings. Auto, make it on auto in the background. And in my line of work, we call this paying yourself first. And it's really about paying your future self. You're going to use the rest of the money for your day-to-day living expenses. But if you pay your future self first, you're going to develop a virtuous cycle that in the background starts running this savings machine. And it's all about kind of putting together personal priorities, right? It's like, do you want to prioritize a fancy annual vacation? Nothing wrong with that. Or would you rather save up over time for a big chunk of time off, like the sabbatical, right? Would you be willing to give up like buying yourself lunch once a week if you knew you could save like an additional $80 to $100 into savings each month? Maybe that's a trade-off you want to make. You can see how everyday life decisions could impact things. And I think what I do in my work is get people to see and find more balance between their current self needs and wants and the things that might take a little bit of time out here in the future space. And so um, if you take savings and you set it aside and it's starting to earn interest, or maybe it's even invested, it can add up and compound really quickly. And so this chart really is simple math for making it completely income agnostic, right? It's like whether you make $300,000 a year or you make $50,000 a year, you could utilize this percentage method of take-home pay, setting it aside, and you could see how just saving 5% of your take-home pay, you could actually fund a 3-month sabbatical every 5 years of your working career. And it wouldn't be that much money in real dollars, right? Like if you're, let's say you make $50,000 a year and you're putting aside 5% of your take-home pay, that's $167 a month. You can see very quickly how some of these life trade-offs could, if you want to prioritize it, could be well within your reach, regardless of your income level. Now, of course, if you can ratchet up your percent of take-home pay savings, you could do this much quicker than you probably would have imagined, right? If you're saving 20% of your take-home pay, like every 2.5 years or so, you could fund a 6-month sabbatical, right? And it starts to be something that like, wow, like I really could do this if I buckled down and tried to figure it out. So my question to you is, Do you think you'd be more likely or willing to save, knowing you could automate the savings and knowing it won't take as long as you imagined? Um, how does it feel to set a savings goal and to start working towards it? What does that bring up for you and how does it actually feel? There's some other ways to jumpstart work on this, right? You can get really creative. Lots of things can sort of put that money in the hopper and get things rolling, like a tax refund, unexpected bonus, inheritance or a gift from a family member, or company stock. A lot of times provides seed money for something like this that I've seen in working with my clients. You may also want to explore employee benefits. It's still a pretty rare benefit to have offered a sabbatical program, but I have seen clients go dig into their HR documents and find out their company had a sabbatical program that they had no idea existed. And like some of the other ideas that were thrown out earlier, you may be able to actually pitch this for your employer as a pilot program, really, and say, look, I'm willing to take some time off unpaid. I think it'd be a really great thing for the company, for branding, but also it's an opportunity for employees under me to kind of step up to the plate and, learn a little bit more about some of these other areas, cross train a bit, maybe show that they could move into other roles themselves. So there's a lot of value in thinking, putting your head in the minds of the HR and the finance people who would be making a decision like this to see if you could pitch it as an idea. Right. In the United States, we also have something called FMLA, Family Medical Leave. And this means that your job is guaranteed for 3 months. You can take time unpaid, but when you come back, your job is guaranteed to be there for you for related to health or family related reasons. So I would argue that mental health, and this is true, mental health is an important part of your overall health. And it would qualify for this FMLA process. And so you would just need to work with your HR to talk, get the right doctor's notes, file the right forms, and take your FMLA. I've also seen clients successfully pair that with a short-term disability payout from their employer benefits and get a 60% of their pay while they're on a 3-month break from work so that they can work on mental health, tackle burnout, and come back to work feeling much more refreshed and much more able to kind of go through and figure out next steps for making your job more sustainable in the long run. All sorts of other things people have done, going abroad, teaching English in Korea, getting a little bit of PIN money to cover that. Fellowships are another thing you could apply for. And this is a little bit different kind of sabbatical where you're doing a little bit of work, but maybe it's unique and fun and somewhat easy work that you could have as sort of a way to spend time while you have much more free time for yourself in the background. You can also rent out your place and go live in a place that's much cheaper to live in and, see how that works out for a while. So there's a lot of ways to get, I think, really creative on the front of financing this or paying for it. There's some other tips to explore. In the US, we have healthcare subsidies and tax credits. And likely, if you're going on sabbatical, your income for the year is going to drop significantly. That means tax deductions are going to come into play that weren't available before. That means you may be able to sell stock and pay a much lower tax rate than if you were working and had your salary. You may find that certain sorts of things just open up for you in your own country's sort of tax space when you have lower income. We always have to deal with, like in the United States, at least, lots of people have student debt and paying for that can get really complicated, but you're eligible for forbearance in most cases when you're not working, you're not taking employment at the time. So there's ways to address that. But you could also, if you are in a position to have money to think through like some more advanced strategies, you could also try to do things like max out your retirement plan at work before you leave your job so that you're reducing your taxable income even further. You may be eligible in a time in the United States. We have something called a Roth IRA where you get you put money in, you don't get a tax deduction, but you get growth and tax-free income later down the line. This is something that if you make too much money, you can't contribute to, but you may be able to in a year like this when your income declines. So there's all sorts of sort of moving pieces to be thinking about financially, and you don't have to figure it all out at once. My book has a lot of great content about digging into figuring out some of these questions, but also, you could just tackle things one by one. You don't have to pour it all on in a day. You can kind of learn this a little bit over time and maybe say, I'm going to dedicate 1 hour a week of my sabbatical to learn a little bit more about some of these topics so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming. Some of the things financially you can and can't do while on sabbatical. Likely, if you leave your job because of choice, you're not going to have unemployment available to you unless you were actually terminated from your job. You're not going to be able to finance or refinance a mortgage. So if that's something on the horizon, you need to take care of that before you lose your paycheck. You're not going to be able to refinance student debt or even probably rent a new place to live because a lot of times landlords are looking to see pay stubs and all of that. So, but interestingly, you can get a new credit card. You probably can get a new car loan. Both of those things are looking at previous year's income, and they're not typically asking for current pay stubs. I don't recommend getting a new credit card to try to finance your sabbatical on debt. That just wouldn't create a virtuous cycle in any way, form, or fashion. But there may be reasons, like if you're planning to start a business or eventually you decide to start a business, you might need to get a new credit card for something like that to get some startup capital. So real quickly, I'm just going to tackle some financial pitfalls and then we'll wrap it up with a quick question for reflection. Just to wrap up some of the things we talked about, it's really important to plan for how long it takes to get through the eventual job hunt or the transition to whatever it is you're going to do next. So in my mind, that extra 3 month kind of window is a great way to financially plan for that. The contingency planning and emergency planning, again, that's 3 to 6 months of expenses covered. And then, we didn't get a chance to touch on this very closely, but you want to make sure you have the right benefits in place as well while you're on work break. You can't suddenly go without healthcare. You may belong to a country where you have access to, government sponsored healthcare and that it's not tied to your job, and that would be fantastic. In the US, we typically have to figure this out for ourselves. But there's other things like disability insurance if you have dependents, life insurance if you have dependents. You want to make sure you don't throw those coverages out the window because your dependents could be left in the lurch if something did happen to you. So there's some things like that to think about. And let's just end it out here with a quick question for reflection. When do you think you could make some time to learn more about some of these other options? I'll wrap it up here and just leave you with a quick QR code. You can access my book on Amazon using this link. There's lots of ways that we can use sabbaticals to kind of push us forward into a new trajectory we never thought was possible. And it's a really great way to reinvent ourselves, honestly. For me personally, I never would have gone down the entrepreneurial path had I not taken a work break. And it's been the most transformative choice I've ever made in my life. So thanks everyone for being here. Loving the conversation today.